There are pitchers who can overpower you. There are pitchers who can intimidate you. And then there are pitchers who simply seem to know what is going to happen before the batter does. Whitey Ford was that kind of pitcher. He didn't have the biggest fastball. He didn't look like the most imposing man on the mound. But when October arrived, the New York Yankees kept putting the ball in his hand, again and again and again. Ford pitched in 11 World Series. He won 6 championships, and in 1961, he did something that even Babe Ruth had never done. He threw 33 and on a third consecutive scoreless innings in the World Series. But those numbers only tell us what Ford accomplished. They don't explain why the Yankees trusted him, because the Yankees had power, they had Mickey Mantle, they had Yogi Berra, they had some of the greatest stars baseball had ever produced. But when the biggest game arrived, when one mistake could change a championship, they turned to a pitcher who didn't need to overpower anyone. He needed to outthink them. He needed to stay calm. He needed to make the perfect pitch when everything was on the line. And somehow, he kept doing it. So what did the Yankees see in Whitey Ford that made them trust him with the biggest moments in baseball? Was it his control, his intelligence, his ability to deceive hitters, or was there something deeper, something that only reveals itself when the pressure becomes almost unbearable? Because Whitey Ford's story is not simply the story of a great Yankee pitcher. It is the story of a man who became more dangerous when the stakes became higher. And to understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. Before Whitey Ford became the pitcher the Yankees trusted in October, he had to earn his place in a clubhouse already filled with stars. He grew up in New York, and for a young pitcher, there could hardly have been a more intimidating destination than Yankee Stadium. This was the organization of Babe Ruth, of Joe DiMaggio, of championship expectations. The Yankees weren't simply trying to win baseball games. They expected to win championships. Ford reached the majors with New York in 1950. He was young, left-handed, and hardly looked like the prototype of a dominant pitcher. There was no overpowering fastball announcing his arrival. Instead, Ford relied on something far more difficult to teach. He knew how to pitch. He learned how to change speeds, how to move the ball, how to attack a hitter's weakness, how to make a good pitch look like a great one, and perhaps most importantly, how to stay composed when the game began to tighten around him. That mattered in New York, because wearing the Yankees uniform meant that every mistake was magnified, every loss was remembered, and every important victory became part of the franchise's mythology. Ford gradually became one of the pitcher's manager Casey Stengel could trust. Then came the postseason, and this is where Ford's career began to separate itself from that of an ordinary successful pitcher. The Yankees kept returning to the World Series. Ford kept returning with them. Year after year, October became familiar territory. While other pitchers were trying to survive the pressure, Ford seemed to understand it. He didn't need to throw harder because the situation was bigger. He didn't need to change who he was. He simply trusted his ability to locate the baseball, read the hitter, and make the next pitch. By the end of his career, Ford had appeared in 11 World Series, more than any pitcher in baseball history. But that record was still ahead of him. First, he had to become the Yankees ace, and that transformation came in the early 1960s. In 1961, Ford produced the greatest regular season of his career. He won 25 games and lost only 4. He led the American League with a remarkable winning percentage. He won the Cy Young Award. But even that wasn't enough to define what Whitey Ford had become, because the Yankees weren't built merely for the regular season. They were built for October, and Ford was about to discover that the biggest stage in baseball was where his reputation would become permanent. The Yankees were heading into the 1961 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds, and Ford was no longer simply a promising left-hander from New York. He was the pitcher the Yankees were going to trust with their championship. The question was no longer whether Whitey Ford could win. It was whether he could do it when everything was on the line. The 1961 World Series gave Whitey Ford the stage he had been building toward for more than a decade. The Yankees faced the Cincinnati Reds, and Ford took the mound carrying something more than the expectations of one game. He was the ace of the Yankees, the pitcher who had just won 25 games, the man New York trusted when the season came down to its final moments. Ford delivered. He won 2 games in the series, including a complete game victory. And by the time the Yankees finished the job, Ford had earned the World Series Most Valuable Player award. But his greatest achievement that October was not the trophy, it was the streak. For years, Babe Ruth had held the record for consecutive scoreless innings in the World Series. Then Whitey Ford came along. In October 1961, Ford extended his scoreless streak to 33 and on a third consecutive World Series innings. The record that had once belonged to Ruth now belonged to the quiet left-hander from New York. And suddenly, Whitey Ford's reputation had changed. He was no longer simply a very good pitcher on a great team. He had become one of the most dependable postseason pitchers baseball had ever seen. But what made the achievement remarkable was the way Ford did it. He wasn't overpowering every hitter. He wasn't blowing fastballs past everyone. He was manipulating hitters, changing speeds, moving the baseball, keeping them uncomfortable, and when a dangerous hitter stepped into the box, Ford seemed to understand exactly what he needed to do. That was the secret of his October greatness. He didn't try to make the moment bigger than it was. He treated the biggest moments like another problem to solve. The following year, the Yankees were back in the World Series. This time, they faced the San Francisco Giants. Ford started Game 1, and once again he delivered. He threw a complete game and defeated the Giants 6-2. But eventually, even the greatest streaks come to an end. During that game, Ford's consecutive scoreless inning streak finally stopped. The record had reached 33 and on a third innings, and it remained one of the most extraordinary postseason pitching achievements in baseball history. Yet there was something even more important happening. The Yankees had discovered exactly what they needed from their ace. When the regular season demanded consistency, Ford gave them consistency. When October demanded courage, Ford gave them courage. When a championship demanded one more great performance, Ford gave them the ball. That trust became the foundation of his legacy. But there was another reason the Yankees could rely on him. Ford wasn't simply surviving pressure. He seemed to understand how to use it. And that ability would become even more important as his career entered its final chapters. Because staying on top is difficult. Staying there while your teammates age, opponents change, and your own body begins to resist you is something else entirely. And Whitey Ford was about to discover just how difficult it could be to remain the Yankees man when the dynasty around him began to change. By the time Whitey Ford's career entered its final years, the Yankees were changing. The stars who had defined the franchise's golden age were getting older. The game was changing. The competition was changing. And Ford's own body was beginning to demand a price. But his greatest weapon had never been youth. It had never been velocity. It had always been understanding. Ford knew how to pitch. He knew how to read a hitter. He knew when to challenge, when to change speeds, when to take something away. And when the moment demanded it, he knew how to make a hitter uncomfortable without ever appearing to overpower him. That is why his career statistics are so revealing. Ford finished with 236 victories, only 106 losses, and a career earned run average of 2.75. His winning percentage was an extraordinary .690. But those numbers still don't fully explain his value to the Yankees. A pitcher can accumulate wins. A pitcher can post a low ERA. But becoming the man a dynasty trusts in October requires something else. It requires credibility, and Ford had earned it. He had been there before. He knew what the World Series felt like. He knew what it meant to pitch with Yankee Stadium watching every move. And perhaps most importantly, his teammates knew that he wouldn't be overwhelmed by the moment. That reputation became part of the Yankees themselves. Mickey Mantle represented power. Yogi Berra represented toughness. The Yankees had stars who could change a game with one swing. Whitey Ford represented something quieter, certainty. When Ford took the mound, there was a feeling that the Yankees had a chance. Not because he was guaranteed to win, no pitcher is, but because everyone knew exactly what he was capable of when the pressure arrived. That is why his 11 World Series appearances matter so much. 6 championships tell us that he was part of a dynasty, but 11 World Series tell us something more personal. For more than a decade, the Yankees kept reaching October and kept trusting Whitey Ford to take the ball. Eventually, the physical toll became too much. Ford's final season came in 1967. He had spent his entire major league career in New York. One uniform, one organization, one extraordinary era. And when he left the mound for the final time, He left behind something very few pitchers ever achieve, not simply statistics, not simply championships, a reputation. The reputation of a pitcher who became better defined by pressure than by power. In 1974, Whitey Ford was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. It was the final confirmation of something the Yankees had understood for years. Ford was not the biggest pitcher. He was not the hardest thrower. He was not the most intimidating man standing on the mound. He didn't need to be. Because baseball is not always won by the pitcher with the best stuff. Sometimes it is won by the pitcher who understands exactly what to do with the moment. And Whitey Ford understood October. That is why his legacy remains so closely connected to the Yankees' greatest years. But there is still one question left. What makes a pitcher become the man you trust when everything is on the line? Is it talent, experience, intelligence, or is it something that cannot be measured at all? Because when the Yankees needed Whitey Ford most, he never needed to be the biggest man on the mound. He only needed to be the one they trusted. Whitey Ford's career can be measured in victories, 236 of them. It can be measured in championships, 6 World Series titles. It can be measured in 11 World Series appearances and a record that once belonged to Babe Ruth. But none of those numbers completely explain why the Yankees trusted him. Because Whitey Ford's greatest weapon was never something you could see on a radar gun. It was his understanding of the game. He understood hitters, he understood pressure, and he understood that the biggest moments in baseball rarely belong to the player who looks the most powerful. They belong to the player who can remain himself when everything around him becomes louder. Ford did that for the Yankees again and again. While the stars around him changed, he remained the quiet constant on the mound. When October arrived, New York knew who they wanted. Whitey Ford. That trust became his legacy. Not because he won every time, but because when the Yankees needed someone to give them a chance, they believed he could. And perhaps that is why Ford remains so important to baseball history. He reminds us that greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, a perfectly placed pitch, a change of speed, a hitter fooled at the plate, a runner stranded, a championship preserved, one difficult moment after another, until eventually those moments become a career, and that career becomes a legend. Whitey Ford never needed to overpower baseball. He learned how to outthink it. He never needed to look like the most dangerous pitcher on the mound. He simply needed to be the one the Yankees trusted when the season was on the line, and when everything was at stake, Whitey Ford was ready for October.